Hey guys. Alright, so today's question comes from someone called ConfusedJungian on Reddit, and they actually have a couple different questions that are interconnected, so I'll just read their comment. They said, as a follow-up to the SJW video, very interesting by the way, thank you, would you say that ESTJs are maybe more inclined towards the anti-SJW mindset? This person says, a lot of them seem to think this way, even if they don't dedicate a lot of time to it. For example, the Laci Green, Blaire White discussion came across to me as FE versus TE a lot of the time. Might have misjudged Blaire White's type though, IDK. And it seems like TE would lend itself to a more meritocratic view of how society should be. So, a few things to address. One is Laci Green and Blaire White. So I have mentioned in the past Laci Green is ENFJ. Blaire White is actually INTJ. I hadn't heard of her before, so I went and watched the video and I'll link it below. Yeah, Blaire White is INTJ, and for those of you who don't know her, she's an anti-feminist, or I honestly haven't watched any of her other videos other than just a few minutes of the one she did with Laci Green. So she's an INTJ. That's actually a really interesting video, at least, you know, like I said, I watched the first 10 minutes or so. ENFJ INTJ is a relationship of supervision, with the ENFJ supervising the INTJ. So that can lead to a lot of like awkwardness in conversation, and I think you'll see that, like Laci keeps trying to make like self-deprecating jokes, or like, and Blaire is just like not reacting at all, and Laci's like more nervous about it and stuff. So I think it's really important when we're talking about, for example, TE, to differentiate between TE in the delta quadra and TE in the gamma quadra. It's actually a different kind of TE. I'm not sure which is which. There's TE plus and TE minus. I'm not sure which belongs where. But deltas, that's NFPs, INFP, ENFP, ESTJ, ISTJ are the delta quadra. And then the gamma quadra is ESFP, ISFP, ENTJ, INTJ. So remember how I mentioned in my SJW video, if you haven't seen that, you should watch that first, that INFPs and ENFPs tend to be the most visible or outspoken SJWs. Well, the same holds true for the other deltas, which is the ESTJs and the ISTJs. They also tend towards especially social justice concerns in general, but it's more complicated. And I'll get into in a minute why it's more complicated. So put that on the back burner. As far as gammas go, that's the NTJs and SFPs. They don't tend to be strongly caring about social justice. Not to say that, especially SFPs do care about people's feelings and being a nice person, you know, and that's not to say like NTJs are assholes or anything, just that it's not like their primary concern going through life. But in general, the gamma quadra is not going to be super involved in popular political movements centered around identity. That's not the kind of the kind of FI they have. Their FI is more inward focused, so figuring out what they want for themselves, not necessarily, you know, what the world thinks of them or whatever, is not as big of a concern to them. Yeah, so I would say it's important to differentiate when you're talking about TE users, whether you're talking about STJs or NTJs, because NTJs are not going to be, you know, there are NTJs that are involved in political movements, obviously. Bernie Sanders is ENTJ, and you know, especially a lot of INTJs can be very passionate, more towards economic issues. That's kind of an SE&I thing in general, to care about economic issues. Karl Marx, Ayn Rand, and then of course you've got people with manifestos, INTJs with manifestos that care about social issues. But yeah, it's generally more from either a theoretical point of view, like coming up with some kind of system that they want to see implemented, or personal vendetta kind of point of view, like they've been wronged or they've experienced something personally and they want to like fix the systemic issues that like literally like the system, the organizational issues, not the belief so much, or the not the identity aspect, you know, like an NTJ who was concerned about like African American rights would be, you know, working specifically to dismantle some particular law that they saw as having a negative effect, and not necessarily raising awareness or making media that supports their viewpoint or anything like that. They would be working on some tangible goal. You're going to see that a lot more with NTJs, gammas. Okay, so moving on to STJs. There's a dichotomy that's important to understand, which is the asking, declaring dichotomy. So half of the types, 8 types, are called asking types, and 8 types are called declaring types. And this is a dichotomy that needs more research. It doesn't have a lot of research, and a lot of what we know is just kind of like was accidentally discovered. Like they interviewed people of a ton of different types and just like wrote down the stuff that they happened to say in common, and then that's like how they identified the dichotomy. They didn't go looking for some specific contrast and then like measure how, you know what I'm saying? So like they're just like, oh, this person said A and this person said B, this person said A, and then they looked at the data and found the correlation. But I think there's a lot of other information that we didn't, maybe questions we didn't think to ask, for example, that could give us more information about these understudied dichotomies. But I have done a little bit of like personal research on the asking versus declaring dichotomy. I find it a really interesting one, actually. And I won't go into it too much today, but the relevant part is that so asking types are types that are looking for an answer. Okay, they're experimental, they're you know, it's in the name, right? They're trying to figure something out. Basically, that they spend most of their life trying to figure out things or trying to test things out. Whereas declaring types are more likely to take something and then apply it. Take some idea or some situation, or we'll get into it a little more what they take, but take something and then implement it. Okay, so you've got the asking, it's figuring out what to implement, and the declaring types that are actually implementing it. And it goes in 2 ways. So there's kind of an alpha beta pair and then a gamma delta pair. So FETI and then TEFI. So in the alpha pair, you've got the asking types are NFJs and NTPs. So the alpha and beta asking types, the NFJs and NTPs, are looking for values. They're trying to determine what our values are and how we can best realize all the possible, let's say this, all the possible ways that we could realize these values. So a lot of NTPs and NFJs are interested in topics like futurism topics, universal basic income and technological unemployment, and like what about, you know, if we, you know, different taxation schemes and stuff. Not the nitty-gritty details, but just taking that idea and running with it in their head and being like, what would happen if we did this? Would that be a good outcome? But not deciding on any one particular thing. And then the declaring types in the alpha and beta quadra, which is the SFJs and the STPs, what they do is they latch on to one of those possibilities that the asking types created. So NFJs and NTPs said we could do this, we could do this, we could do this, and the SFJs and STPs said, this one's obviously the best thing, now let's make it happen, right? So you get the SFJs and the STPs that are more likely to commit to one course of action and to find a way to make that realized. With the delta and gamma types, so that's the people who value FI and TE, the direction is actually reversed to a certain extent. So the declaring types in the gamma and delta quadras are NFPs and declaring types, NFPs and NTJs. Okay, so the NFPs and the NTJs are the ones who do, for example, like I said, the NTJs often have a manifesto, right? And the NFPs often have some core value they've already decided on it. They're not saying, well, maybe we could combine all the cultures, or maybe we could do this and maybe we can do that. Like, no, like they choose the kind of values that they want to implement, but they're not particularly concerned with the exact form with which it's implemented. And I want to make it clear, because I've had a couple people say this, that not all NFPs are social justice warriors or are liberal or anything like that. Like, there are lots of NFPs that are conservative. It's just that it's not that all NFPs are social justice warriors, it's just that a lot of social justice warriors are NFPs. So that's, I think, important to clarify. But the approach, whether they're conservative or liberal or libertarian or whatever, the approach is often similar. Let me clarify a bit, because I think I might have made it confusing before when I said NTJs like some kind of concrete solution. So what I'm talking about there is someone like Bernie Sanders, who decides, you know, I'm a democratic socialist. This is the system. We should have universal health care. We should have, you know, free college tuition, those kind of things, right? So he's focused on some specific policy objective, some specific, like, concrete real world objective. Whereas the NFPs are focused on some specific value, right? So, you know, an SJW NFP, it might be like implementing safe spaces or racial equality. Whereas for you know, an NFP who's real conservative, it might be something like America First, right? Some specific core value that doesn't necessarily have a concrete action plan in place, right? So the declaring types in this group, the declaring types come up with the goal. Either it's universal healthcare, or it's, you know, America First, or you know, tribal sovereignty or something, some core concept. They decide on it. And then the asking types in this group, so that's the STJs and the SFPs, are the ones who implement it then, right? So they take this decision and then they test. Well, if we do it this way, will it get us closer to our values? If we do it this way, will it help us get closer to that long-term goal that's been set out for us? They're not questioning the goal itself the way NFJs and NTPs do, the other asking types, but they're questioning the methodology. What method will get us closest to achieving that goal that's been set out for us? And of course, it's circular. It's not just like one direction. Then, you know, the NFPs and the NTJs look at what's happened, and then they say, like, do I like this? Am I agreeing with this? And so on. You know, and based on how they feel about the things that are happening, then they might develop a new goal, which then spurs the STJs and the SFPs to action and so forth. Right, so we're mostly talking about TEFI in this video, so I'm gonna leave the alpha and betas for another day. Let me know if you're interested in hearing more about them. So when you're asking, like, how does TE deal with SJW or anti-SJW, I would say in general, TE is not, again, generally, strongly correlated with anti-SJW mentality. That's mostly, you're going to see that in STPs and NFJs, I would say, are the ones who are most likely to be anti-SJW. You do get a lot of disaffected deltas, NFPs and STJs in those circles too, so it's not like exclusively beta, but I would say it originates more in beta ideals. Betas tend to be very competitive, and we like to think of ourselves as independent and self-sufficient, although obviously nobody's truly independent or self-sufficient. But yeah, so you do see, as I've said, there's a contingent of NFPs and STJs who are anti-SJW, especially like Bill O'Reilly is ESTJ, Megyn Kelly is ESTJ, I think Ann Coulter is probably ESTJ. I haven't officially typed her, but that seems right. You know, ISTJs tend not to be very outspoken about their beliefs in general. Most of the ISTJ conservatives I've known are kind of like more paleocon, just kind of like Ron Swanson types, you know, like just like keep the government away from me and like I'll just do my thing. There are a lot of ISTJs that are also SJWs, or they're not as passionate about the ideology itself. They're more interested in the implementation. So ISTJs like Amy Goodman. I wouldn't call Amy Goodman, she's the host of Democracy Now! I wouldn't call her like an SJW. I think she's just a journalist that's interested in issues of social justice. That's what you're going to find a lot more, because if you're talking about spreading and promoting ideology, that's primarily something you're going to see with the NFPs, and to a certain extent the NTJs, if we're talking about ideology less and goals, like tangible goals more. And it generally, you know, obviously there's communication between all quadras, but within a quadra is where you see the most movement. You know, the STJs are trying to implement NFP ideas, the SFPs are trying to implement NTJ ideas, and so forth. Yeah, I would say, you know, and there's a natural progression to it. A lot of the SJW ideas they originated in academia, and then they were amplified by Tumblr, especially 5-10 years ago. It started getting really big, but it was the discourse at that point. And then when it was decided, okay, we need safe spaces, okay, we need you know, more representation in video games or things like that. Once those ideas were decided, they started to be implemented, and I would say it was more likely STJs in a lot of cases that were actually implementing these, in terms of hiring more women for their board of whatever, like their corporate board, or you know, writing into the rules of the school that you can't have hate speech on your show. You know, they took these ideas that had been crystallized, and then they found ways to try to implement them. And then so now what you're seeing a lot, and I think a lot of people have noticed that there seems to be kind of an internal backlash among SJWs. A lot of really strongly held beliefs are starting to become more nuanced, and you know, there's infighting. You know, there's certain groups of people, and this is true for any ideology, but I think it's really noticeable in this one, is that there's certain groups of people that just can never be satisfied. Like, no matter what you do, no matter how much you try, like, their whole point is just is to be critical of it. And that's, I want to make it clear, that's not like an unnecessary aspect of society. Like, it's always necessary to have critics in society. Like, that's how you make sure, you know, you're doing the right thing. But if you are doing the right thing, then the critics are going to be wrong, right? So, you know, you've got to have people questioning, but just because someone's questioning doesn't mean they're right. You know, you have to make that judgment for yourself. But yeah, so, okay, so what was the question? Are the ESTJs more inclined towards the anti-SJW mindset? No, I wouldn't say particularly. I think it's more common with STPs. There are anti-SJW ESTJs. Most likely they came from a background that was conservative. They came into a situation where they were being paid to be conservative, where being conservative was necessary in order to succeed at their business. Generally, STJs adopt ideology that's necessary for achieving real-world goals. Whether those goals are to be more successful in business, or whether they're to fit into their community better, or it's rare that you'll find an STJ that will die on a hill for a particular ideology. Usually they're pretty amenable and open to conversation about it. So they're not the ones that, you're right, because they're asking types. So they are open to taking in new perspectives, as long as they're presented in a non-threatening way, ideally. I mean, considering the fact that they have low FI, they're not going to be as concerned with issues of value or justice as other types in general. There are like individual exceptions, but as a group, that's not what they spend as much of their time on. So you will see fewer of them fighting for social justice just by virtue of like the type they are, being thinkers, I mean. And finally, as for meritocracy, that's actually related to a different dichotomy that I haven't gotten involved in this video, which is the aristocratic versus democratic dichotomy. SFs and NTs are democratic, and NFs and STs are aristocratic. So I don't want to go into it too much here. I could make a whole video about it, but basically when you're talking about meritocracy, which is everyone starts on an even playing field, and then the person who gets ahead is the one who fights the hardest, who has the most education, who, you know, works the longest hours, and who gets the best test scores, with no other considerations. What I would call a meritocracy is preferred by democratic types. TE in NTJs and SFPs is where you're gonna see like pro meritocracy more. You know, deltas are more likely to take personalized needs, starting positions, goodness into consideration. You know, the idea that a sexist shouldn't be the head of a company. You know, even if they're the best CEO, they make the most money, they, you know, make the best product, if they're sexist, or if they're, you know, from a conservative point of view, if they're, you know, too liberal or too wishy-washy, some negative, they voted for Hillary or something, a conservative delta would not want them to represent their company, right? So it's less meritocratic in that way. It's more about identity. For betas, it's about tribe more. So people who are like me, not necessarily in like a racial or even a nationalistic way, although it can be. Like I'm a beta, and for me, I tend to be more tribal along class lines. So I would feel a lot more comfortable working alongside people who had similar socioeconomic backgrounds to mine, or like mine or poorer. Basically, I would feel really uncomfortable working with someone who had been brought up in a really wealthy family. Like, and that's not to say that they couldn't be just as good or even better at their job, but it's that kind of like tribal breakdown. Like, are you one of me or were you one of them, you know? And like, obviously individuals can mitigate these preferences somehow, but yeah, so if you're talking about TE being meritocratic, I think that's mostly in the gamma quadra, so which is what Blaire White is, since she's INTJ. So if that applies to the question, then that just goes to show. So, all right, I hope I answered the question. I know I was a little bit scattered in this video. I really enjoyed it, and if you guys have any more questions you want me to address, just let me know. All right, talk to you soon.